Tonight on Free Minds TV, we discuss Rick Santorum's position on pornography. We'll also be talking about privatizing roads, New Hampshire passing an industrial hemp bill, plus a whole lot more tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. It is episode 246, and it's Toby here with you.
And Nick.
All right, Nick, we are going to be getting into a couple of articles about privatization, something we've talked about on the show before, and a lot of our viewers feel very strongly about it, of getting the government out of certain sectors of the economy and letting private businesses take over for that. So we'll be getting into some discussion about roads as well as the TSA, and also some good news coming out of New Hampshire on the grounds of hemp. But first, let's talk about Rick Santorum. He seems to be big in the news. At least he's gaining traction, so to speak.
Well, not in Puerto Rico, though. I think he made some comments about how Puerto Ricans should speak English. Well, even though they live in Puerto Rico. I think Mexicans should speak English too. It would make things more convenient.
Despite that fact, he still is becoming more and more popular every day.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, I think he might be the Republican Party's nominee. There's a chance of it anyway, as much as I'm not going to vote for Romney. Romney next to Rick Santorum doesn't look quite so bad. Ron Paul, of course, still in the race, but at this point, it's obvious he's not going to win the nomination. I'll still root for him, but he's not going to win the nomination. So, what would Rick Santorum do as nominee? Well, one of the things he would do is, at least if he follows through on his pandering on the campaign trail, which, there's a good chance he won't actually do this, Toby, because politicians say a lot of things on the campaign trail to get elected, which they don't actually follow through on once they're in office. But Rick Santorum is continuing what is a faith-based campaign with a pledge to wipe out pornography in his administration. Santorum has said that the Obama administration has turned a blind eye to those who wish to preserve our culture from the scourge of pornography, and has refused to enforce obscenity laws. He pledges that he will vigorously enforce laws that prohibit distribution of hardcore or obscene pornography on the internet, on cable, satellite TV, on hotel motel TV, in retail shops, and through the mail or by common carrier.
That's going to be.
He knows a lot about porn, doesn't he?
It's going to be pretty difficult to fight that battle. It seems like a losing battle. There are quite literally billions upon billions of porn sites out there.
Yeah, and especially when you come to the internet argument. I mean, I'm not even sure how much the obscenity argument that has historically been applied really works in that case, because you're dealing with a situation where you have an adult accessing information through the web that they obviously don't find obscene or objectionable, or they wouldn't be accessing it. But it's not actually, there's no physical copy of the pornography anywhere in the community, whereas in the past that would have actually involved magazines or videotapes or theaters in the community, actual physical copies of the material that were displayed in the community. But now we live in a world where if people want to access porn, they can do it in the privacy of their own homes, direct to a server somewhere, and there's, the community doesn't actually see that at all. So I don't even know what the rationale is behind enforcing an obscenity law when you have an adult watching other consenting adults do things that other people might not like, but they don't have to see because it's not in their living room, it's not on their computer.
Well, I think Rick Santorum's argument would be that those the society and the community have to live with the repercussions that come from the adult viewing such horrible and mind-altering, bending images.
A lot of what I've
video.
Heard, I'm sure Rick Santorum would like to do all kinds of things to criminalize homosexuality again, or certainly other Republicans like him would. I don't think we need a president who's involved in the bedroom affairs of individual Americans. And number one, I don't see how it's consistent with my interpretation of the New Testament, and I'm not religious, but from what I've read, Jesus' message was about peace and forgiveness and understanding, not prosecuting people. What Rick Santorum's talking about here with a rigid moral code, basically a shame-based sexual code, is a lot of what you heard coming out of the Old Testament. And the New Testament, what was preached by Jesus was kind of an answer to, the Old Testament's prescriptions, where, you'd kill gay people. The Bible says to do that, Toby. Kill gay people, kill adulterers, kill all kinds of people who we think it would be inappropriate to kill in, a civilized, advanced society like our own. So Rick Santorum's views on this are not going to get him elected. This isn't a popular position to take. I don't think it's a particular... personally, in my view, it's not a very Christian position to take, and it's not a conservative position to take.
You know what worries me, though, Nick, is it is actually working for him. And that's what's so worrisome to me, is it's not really yes, I know Santorum is a complete maniac, but what about all the people who are worshiping him and really think that he would...
The Republican base?
It worries me to think that so many millions of people are...
The Republican base is aging. If you exclude young people who are largely going for Ron Paul, who are fiscally conservative and socially liberal, if you actually look at the demographic shift, Toby, in 20 years, if the GOP continues, basically advancing a platform like what Rick Santorum's advancing, they're not going to be a competitive national party. That's just the way it is, because the shift in American society generally, and especially among people under the age of 30, 35, is to be fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Rick Santorum, in my opinion, is neither of those things. I don't think it's not a conservative position to take. Where does the federal, where in a fiscal conservative or a constitutional conservative's mind, does the President of the United States have, even if you believe in obscenity laws, where does the President of the United States, the head of the executive branch of the federal government, have a role in what kind of videos you can watch? I mean, we've heard conservatives screaming about President Obama, the Obama administration overseeing some of these things. Like SOPA and people were criticized by some on the right. Basically anything that the Obama administration has done that could be viewed as an affront to civil liberties, Republicans have been quick to capitalize on. This is just hypocrisy. It's not conservative. I don't think it's particularly Christian of them.
Sure, but
and
in the same exact
I don't think in the long run this will help him win Alabama. This will help him win the red states that he needs to win the Republican nomination. Will it help him win the general election if he's a nominee? No. If Rick Santorum goes up against Barack Obama, barring some unforeseen major world event that really makes Obama look bad, Santorum's not going to win. I don't think Santorum's electable in a national general election, thankfully.
And if it's
not that Obama's really, I'm that happy to stay with Obama.
And if it's Romney and Obama, I guess it really doesn't matter 6-1 way.
That's a toss-up. That's a toss-up. I'd flip a coin on that. Deep down in my heart of hearts, if it was Santorum against Obama, they're bad in different ways. I'd almost have to say. I think Santorum is a little... I think he's a typical politician.
Well,
I'm not even sure
worries
this is
me
something,
more.
He's...
You know why? Because Santorum
shifty.
worries me more. Anyone who's going after whatever is going on in the bedroom and your personal social liberties, that's what worries me most. And trust me, I understand that Obama is awful on many social liberties issues, but I mean, it's those people, the moral crusaders, I think they're the people in government who worry me the most.
Yeah, especially that wing of the Republican Party does
upbringing.
not do too much for me. Number one, probably because of my value set. And number two, even from the perspective of somebody who, is socially conservative, that's really what you're concerned about right now, is porn. That's what you think the problem with American society is today. I mean, it's just completely misplaced values, and if that's where Republicans want to put their emphasis, then who needs them?
Not to mention that. Going back to one point that it's completely impossible to get rid of.
Maybe they should stick to, say, the national debt and things like that, where Republicans do, in my opinion, do marginally better.
No, we need to create a couple more bureaucracies to shut down all
the porn,
the billions of websites. That's
not to mention the gays, Toby. We really got to get a handle on this gay
We're going to need to expand government in those regions. Well, of course, that's to propagate
and all
conservative issues.
Right, and all other non-conservative Christians.
Oh, of course. All right. Well, speaking of being conservative, true conservatives say there should be fewer government programs, right? And more things should be left up to markets to provide goods and services to people. One of those being the TSA. And you've got an article about the TSA, then I've got one about the roads. Mm-hmm. What would that mean? Is this really privatizing the TSA? I don't know. I haven't read the article.
Well, I mean, I guess in the parlance of today, it might be privatizing the TSA. Infowars.com reporting one of America's busiest airports, Orlando Sanford International, has announced it will opt out of using TSA workers to screen passengers, a move which threatens the highly unpopular federal agency's role in other airports across the nation. But I question whether this matters. The president of the airport said Tuesday that he would apply again to use private operators to screen passengers using federal standards and oversights, according to the Miami Herald. So if you've got private employees contracted to work at this airport, applying the same standards and procedures as the TSA, who cares, Toby? Do I care whether it's somebody who's hired by the airport or somebody who's hired by the federal government? I mean, you might think it would cost less, but that's not necessarily the case. Number one, now, while the private company might be more efficient, now you've involved a profit motive. Many airports around the country are not private at all. They're municipal, either municipal enterprises or they're partnerships between big business and municipalities or state governments. So what you're talking about here is just a shell game as far as where the paychecks are actually coming from. I think most of that money will be coming from public sources still, and they'll still be doing the same screenings as the TSA. So I don't give a damn.
So it makes me feel kind of bad in a sense. We've been downing the TSA for years and blaming the TSA for years when in actuality, the TSA is just doing the same thing as a private organization would be doing.
Well, no, that's not what I'm
prerogative.
saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not talking about prerogative. If the airport was left to enforce its own safety standards and do it with a private enterprise, that would be different. But what you're talking about is applying federal standards and oversight to the process. So you've got a private company doing whatever the federal government tells them to do. Now, that's very different than true privatization, where the airports are responsible for security, Toby. All you've got here is a private company contracting with the government on some level or another to do the same things that the government would do. In fact, they might even go further. They might be more, I mean, typically I do think private enterprises are more effective in the way they use resources. Maybe they'd be more efficient, but when we're talking about an organization that troubles most of us, or at least probably most of you watching the show, because we're worried about it invading our rights, well, if they're more effective at doing that job, which is basically invading our rights, patting down our genitals, whatever it is, then a private company is probably just going to be better at invading our privacy, patting down our genitals, and generally harassing us.
Interesting way to
This
look
is
at
not,
things.
I don't see how this is privatization at all. This is just involving a corporation as a middleman to enforce government standards. And we've seen this with private prisons, Toby.
Yeah.
You've got private companies running prisons. Often they're just making the conditions worse, taking a similar amount of money. Sometimes they run them cheaper, but generally what they're doing is, they're running the prisons as cheaply as they can, and they're just stuffing money in their pockets. I don't see how that's appropriate at all. I'm a big believer in I see a big role for the free market, but I don't believe in this this thing where we use private companies to do the government's dirty work. If you want to socialize something or you want something run by the government, run it as a public good by the government. Just if you want airport security, applying federal standards, have the federal government do it. If you want a federal healthcare system, and over half the money we have in this country today, Toby, is spent by government as far as our healthcare money goes. Nationalize it. I would rather have a nationalized healthcare system than this junk we have in the U.S. today. The system we have in the U.S. today has the government spending more than half the money on healthcare. But we've still got private insurers making a profit as part of this system. I mean, we're a country that doesn't do big government well. And I'm opposed to big government, period, on principle. But
if
when
you're
you
going to have
look
big government, might as well do big government,
do it effectively. If you look at a lot of the social democracies around the world, they get a lot more for not that much more in tax money because they know how to run a socialized system. If you want a socialist country, socialize it and run it right. I'm sick of this crap where, we try to pretend we've got a free market economy because private companies are taking profits on your tax dollars, because that's what's happening today.
All right.
And it's sold as a free market, and it's not.
I've got a story that kind of dovetails into it, and I'm guessing, and I may understand where you're coming from or going to come from on this story, but it has to do with the roads. It's not taking place here in the United States. It's taking place in the United Kingdom. As we've always said on this show, their government system is a few years ahead of ours. The bills are coming due to them a little bit earlier than they're coming due here in the United States, and it's making it difficult for them, even more difficult for them to upkeep some of their roads. I mean, they're definitely falling apart here in the United States, but we can push it off for another 5-10 years, right? Britain, well, they're thinking about privatizing the roads in order to repave them and build the failing infrastructure. Britain's cash-strapped government could lease chunks of its road network to private sectors, said Prime Minister David Cameron, in a way to seek to improve the country's infrastructure to stop it from falling further behind its competitors. The move to seek help from sovereign wealth funds and private investors came after news Cameron had only managed to secure £2 billion from pension funds for a new project by 2013, far short of £20 billion target. Cameron said that the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, due to publish its 2012 budget and economic update on Wednesday, would like to look at introducing more tolling on its new roads. And looking at some of the private investors, that's what they're talking about doing as well, would be setting up tolls along the leased portions of the road. Now, I think, going back to what you're saying, when you're talking about something like the roads, if the tolls on the roads would truly be to upkeep the roads, well, that profit motive supposedly wouldn't be there if it was the government doing it. But if a private company's doing it, they would be incentivized to just keep the tolls going and collect more and more money as much as they possibly can. Mm-hmm. But then again, what we've seen here in the United States, at least, on toll roads, is the government doesn't just collect the money to pay for that road. They'll keep the tolls up there and just keep collecting money and put it in other pockets of the government as well. So what's the solution here? Clearly, giving it over to the privatized road systems, giving it over to various competitors here, well, they could easily just jack up the tolls and continue to collect that money, far more than pays for the road, but same with the government. So what's the solution?
I don't know. I don't think the solution is to keep the government in control of the roads, lease them to a private company, so that the private company has to pay a lease to the government and make room for profits after expenses in there, and make enough money to pay for the roads. And that's their number 3 priority. Number 1, to pay the lease. Number 2, to make a profit. Number 3, to maintain the road. It's a terrible solution. I'm not sure there's a great solution when it comes to existing government roads. But frankly, I think when we're talking about privatization on this model, what you're really dealing with is just allowing some company to take profits. And what they're talking about here, Toby, they mentioned private investors and sovereign wealth funds. I mean, you can see how tangled the web is, because sovereign wealth funds are government-sponsored companies, basically, that go around the world investing. Dubai had a large one. China has major sovereign wealth funds. I mean, it's common practice around the world, but a sovereign wealth fund is a nationalized investment firm. So what they're talking about in the UK is allowing companies or entities that are sponsored by foreign governments, whether it's China, Russia, Dubai, to come into the UK, lease the roads from the government in the UK, and try to earn a profit for the sovereign wealth fund and theoretically for people in another country or for another country's government. It's just insane. It's a terrible idea. How is that going to make it less expensive to provide for the road? I don't get it.
You know, I was watching a documentary recently about the mob. And just so much of what's going on here, and it's talking about how the mob is essentially a good old boy network of contracting work out to different contractors and stuff and shaking people down, giving the contracts to certain individuals. You can only buy cement from the sky. Seems very much similar to what goes on a much larger level sometimes with various governmental systems across the United States working with corporations and these sovereign wealth funds. But oh well, what are you going to do?
I don't know, but that's the problem. I mean, largely what we're hearing about with privatization is this idea of things that have traditionally been public goods provided at taxpayer expense. And I don't have a problem with toll roads. I think toll roads are a much better solution than funding roads through taxes. People who use particular stretches of road or interstate, you know,
it only makes sense. I mean, why do I care about maintaining a sector of road on the side of the state that I barely ever use? I'd much rather pay $1 twice a year when I use it.
Right. If you're going to pay for, you know, a really expensive road system or highway system that saves people commuting time, people who use that on a regular basis, they should pay proportionate to how much they use the road. I'm fine with a toll road. I just don't know how, you know, bringing in a private company in the name of privatizing the road, when really the government still owns the road, the private company leases it from the government and then runs that road at a profit, which is the only reason why a private company would want to run it in the first place. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. Doesn't really make the situation any better, doesn't fundamentally make you any more free, and I don't think it saves us any money or really gives us better roads in the long run.
They need another word. Is there a word for a mix of privatizing and government mingled together and interwoven?
A lot of people refer to it as corporatism or fascism.
Oh.
It's unpopular. I mean, people get turned off by using that term in the U.S., but really that's, if you look at a definition of what it is, that's you know, public-private partnerships, GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. I mean, all of that stuff is really, I think, the core of not a socialist system, but a fascist or a corporatist system, whatever you want to call it. And that's the road we're on in the U.S. It's not towards traditional communism or socialism. We're on a road towards privatized profits and socialized losses, and where the taxpayers bear the expense, you know, basically bail out big companies, subsidize their profit margins, and the government plays a role in ensuring that the system stays in place.
Meanwhile, the middle class gets completely eroded. The lower class is really suffering, but they're getting their scraps from the government, and there's the upper class getting extremely wealthy. Right.
Well, I mean, we're talking about with corporatism, or with the government picking winners and losers, we're talking about how business has largely been done around the world throughout most of human history and still is today. It's just the U.S. was a little bit different for a while, actually did have somewhat of a true free market system for a long time, and I think that's what really allowed us to have an enormous middle class, a more equitable distribution of wealth. The path we're on right now is, you know, back towards what Europe is like, or the old world, maybe not Europe specifically.
The old world. All right, well, that's a lot of bad news. Let's get into some good news. This coming from New Hampshire, where we are broadcasting the show from. Coming from Concord, New Hampshire, the New Hampshire House is giving the nod to hemp farmers after passing a bill to protect industrial hemp from being targeted as an illicit drug. The bill, which passed the House Wednesday without debate, would forbid industrial hemp, a botanical cousin to marijuana, from being listed as a controlled substance. It would only go into effect after the Drug Enforcement Agency certifies that at least 2 other New England states have adopted such legislation. Supporters say hemp was once an important crop in the United States, but has not been grown in New Hampshire for decades. They say that the plant has low levels of THC, a principal chemicals in cannabis, lower levels than marijuana, and can be used in a variety of non-illicit products. So that's some good news. I mean, everybody out there who thinks that you can get high from smoking hemp, well...
They obviously haven't tried.
No, I haven't tried either, Nick, but I have read a lot about it, and, well, no, you don't get high from smoking hemp at all. In fact, if you really were really gung-ho about getting rid of marijuana, at least growing it here in New Hampshire, what you'd do is you'd plant a whole bunch of hemp, and then the cross-pollen of the 2 plants would render the THC in the marijuana plants useless, and it would get rid of it, and it would destroy the THC-bearing marijuana plants. So, yes, very low levels of THC, but if you really were serious about getting rid of cultivation of marijuana here in New Hampshire, well, plant a bunch of hemp.
Yeah, I mean, hemp is a very different crop, very different uses from, I mean, it's very similar biologically to marijuana with the exception of the THC content. But its uses, its purposes are a lot different, and it was cultivated for a lot of U.S. history. You know, that's where the word canvas originally comes from, is cannabis. It was used for sails, it was used for covered wagons. It was made from hemp. Rope was, there were some, you know, was used for making rope, was used for making clothing in many cases, and it does have the potential to be used to extract oils and resins too, for use in things like basically plastics and oils that could act as alternatives to petroleum-based oil, and pretty cheaply too. It's a cheap fiber crop, it's a cheap oil crop, and there's been talk about making biodiesel and things like that from hemp, but we're not allowed to really explore any of that. They do grow it in other countries, but farmers here in the U.S. have been denied the opportunity to grow that crop. And if you want to get products made from hemp here in the U.S., likely you're using hemp that's imported from Canada. Probably most of it from Canada. I mean, I guess it could be from somewhere else, but
which comes with a tariff, which
yeah.
drives the prices on hemp products up, which
yeah.
makes people go, well,
I mean,
why would we need hemp products? The
right.
prices are higher, and so the public out there doesn't know the good that hemp can be used for, doesn't know that it can be very profitable. It can be used in a variety of different purposes, but because it's not grown
yeah.
here, I think that largely people don't understand it.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, most of the rest of the world does have hemp available as a crop, and it hasn't solved all the problems. Some people will talk about hemp like it's going to solve all the problems of the world. Well, sure. It hasn't in Canada. They're not off of petroleum because they grow hemp. But it does have legitimate uses. It is useful in certain ways. And
it's a cash crop for that can help boost the economy.
I think if you allow American farmers to grow hemp as a fiber crop, as an oil crop, and you eliminated farm subsidies for things like corn in the Midwest and wheat and tobacco, you'd probably see quite a bit of hemp cultivated in the U.S. again, to the point where it could potentially be competitive with cotton, which is, many people argue, is one of the reasons it was made illegal in the first place, was that cotton growers didn't want it, timber landowners didn't want it, petroleum companies didn't want it, a whole lot of people didn't want to have to compete with hemp. So they banned it right along with marijuana.
Yeah, some people argue that it was...
They called it marijuana to ban hemp, is what many people argue.
That's what many people say. One of the driving forces behind banning marijuana, it was to get rid of hemp. So some good news. We'll see if it ever comes to light. I don't know what this DEA provision even means.
Right.
And it still has some work to go. So we'll see. A little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but I'm sure there's still quite the road to get there. All right, we are out of time for this week. Log on to freemindstv.com. From there, you can get the archives of the show, contact information, the radio show, Sundays 3 to 5 p.m. If you want to check out any of that, freemindstv.com. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a good one.